So good evening, everybody, and welcome to this delightful evening with my guest, Marcia B. We are going to be talking about creating consent culture and talking about that in a pretty casual way, and then pointing you to this exciting new resource that Marcia is offering to the world of her book coming out on the 21st, which is Friday. Yes, on creating consent culture. So we want to whet your appetite with that this evening. I decided tonight I would sort of give you Marcia's more formal bio. But Marcia is a sexual communication coach. She's the co-founder of Cuddle, which many of you may have tried out already, and the CEO of Asking for What You Want, with over 17 years of experience. Marcia is a sought-after presenter at conferences across North America and a teacher for the School of Consent. I like to offer a little more personal, introduction. And there's so many stories I could share, but I think the one I'm going to share was the first time I believe I met you in person. You and I were both teaching at a weekend conference, and I had the unfortunate privilege of teaching at 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning, which I actually was wondering if anybody would show up, but Marcia showed up. She wasn't the only one in the room, thankfully. And I was so nervous. I just knew of you by reputation. I was like, Marcia's in the room. And little did I know how down to earth you are and how just totally amazing you are. But yeah, that birthed so much. You invited me to join a wonderful mastermind, and we've become fast friends since. So I'm so grateful that you're here and that you're speaking on this really important subject, because I think some of us think we know what consent is, but I know you are an expert on the subject. And in many of the communities I move in, and I'm sure people listening in too, we all need to know more about consent, and both what it is and how to make sure we're getting it and implementing it to honor those around us. So yeah, Marcia, won't you tell us a little bit about what consent means to you and how you got passionate about bringing consent and creating consent culture in the world?
Yeah, if you had asked me when I started my career if this is what I was going to be doing, I would have been like, what? Because 20 years ago or whatever, like, consent was not really a conversation. There was a bit of like, yes means yes. I don't even think yes means yes was a thing yet. It was just no means no. It was kind of the extent of what consent was about. So I've been a sex educator since I was a teenager, really, when I started doing HIV peer counseling, or peer counseling, not coaching. And in the 90s. And I wanted to be a sex educator when I grew up. I was just really interested in like how people can come together and the different ways they could come together, and also just sort of mystified by the misinformation and like misinformation and lack of information that was kind of out there. I grew up in the South. Purity culture was, and probably still is, quite a big thing then. And I was also a very direct child. I was a very had kind of a big personality, which didn't really fit in well in the South. And so, yeah, I moved to New York in 2000. I tried a bunch of different little projects, got some coaching certificates and things along the way. And then in 2004, I co-created Cuddle Party with Reed Mahalko. And that was like, we just thought it was another one of these little workshops. And overnight, it like basically exploded. And within 6 weeks of our first event, we were literally international news. We had a friend who was in India, and he woke up one morning. He's like, what are Marcia and Reed doing? This is pre-Facebook. And he literally opened the International Times in India and was like, oh, I guess that's what they're doing. Like, saw an article about New Yorkers are cuddling. And my mom, hilariously, when I first told her about Cuddle Party, she was like, you never sat still long enough to cuddle as a kid. She's like, she was sort of mystified by it. Because in her mind, I wasn't that cuddly of a kid. I was always running around. But the thing that kind of became clear to me, and then I did for years. I'm polyamorous, and I ran an open relationship discussion group for many, many years. And basically, I have sort of spent my entire career helping people figure out what they want and how to talk about it. And the thing that has kind of always interested me, whether we're talking about how to bring up that you want to use a condom for safer sex, how you ask to cuddle somebody, how you talk about open relationships, how you literally anything with intimacy, is there's a moment where you're like, oh crap, I want something. Now I have to talk about it. And so asking for what you want kind of became my thing. And kind of a corollary to that is boundaries. And like with, Cuddle Party and with open relationships and with sex, it was like, oh, okay, same things. Like you want to be close, but you don't want to do that thing. And how do you navigate that tension of being close, but not wanting to do the thing the other person wanted to do? And meanwhile, I'm doing this over the course of whatever, 17, 18 years. A whole other consent conversation was starting to grow in the kink community. And then it kind of started spilling out. It started kind of coming from the sex positive community, like sex educators. It started being more put forth in schools. Yes means yes. It's not just no means no. Enthusiastic consent became a catchphrase. And so there's this kind of developing thing culturally that was happening at the same time. And I kind of realized that like the thing that ties everything that I've been doing together, the asking for what you want, the saying no to what you don't want, the listening to when people give you that information, that's all consent. That's all consent stuff. And I think why I didn't realize that I was doing consent work for such a long time is I, like a lot of people, had a misconception that consent was somebody asks and then you just say yes or no. And it's actually like considerably more complex than that. Yes and no. It's just it's a more complex framework. And so we can get into that more in a minute, but that's kind of how I got into it. And I'll just stop there and let you digest that.
Great. So I'm very familiar with Cuddle Party, knowing both you and Reed. I've been to multiple Cuddle Parties, love them. Yeah. But just in case there are people watching or joining us live that have no idea what Cuddle Party is, give us the
short version. Yes. So it is a non-sexual workshop and social event centered around communication, boundaries, and touch. So we have a bunch of rules. We kind of basically do a little consent workshop, and say little, it's about an hour long. And then we have kind of freeform cuddling, right? For about 2 hours after that. And then there's a little closing circle. And so it's about a 3.5 hour event. Some people come to get their touch needs met. Some people come to practice their boundaries. Some people come to practice noticing what they actually want. Some people come because they are regulars and their friends are there. Obviously, we have not been having very many of those this past couple of years, and a lot of our regulars are really sad about that. But it really became kind of a sort of shockingly popular thing. And what I realized pretty quickly in doing Cuddle Party was that people were not just touch starved, which is true for many of us, certainly true for me during the pandemic, but they were starved for opportunities to even notice what they wanted, and they were starved for experiences of communicating their boundaries and having their boundaries respected. People were like having sort of epiphanies because they were getting a somatic experience of, oh, what I say that I want to have happen to my body or don't want to have happen to my body matters. And I actually get to have this like felt experience of bodily autonomy. And I didn't expect any of that. I just thought, oh, we figured out a cool thing and people can come and cuddle and that'll be fun. I didn't realize when we were creating it why people would be reacting so strongly. And we ended up reverse engineering it to kind of get that, to get that clarity. And that was in 2004. So it's been a minute.
And it's really a communication workshop. Like
It is,
you do get to cuddle, which is amazing. The last one I was at, it was in San Jose. And I remember this, I walked up to this guy and I'm like, because you teach all these wonderful exercises where you get to practice saying yes and saying no, or renegotiating, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today. And I walked up to this guy and I was like, do you want to cuddle? And he was like, sure. And that was my introduction. I had never met him before. And he lay next to me for a few minutes and he's like, wow, this is really kinky. Now, some of my audience might know that for me, cuddling, I love touch and I love being in a space where it can be non-sexual, but that certainly, it is not a kinky space for me. So I was like, well, tell me about that. How is this kinky for you? And he's like, this is blowing my mind that I just met you like 2 minutes ago and we're lying here cuddling. So I love that a lot of the work was actually birthed from Cuddle Party, because it's a pretty profound experience, both because everybody gets to receive some delicious touch in community in a structured and safe environment, but you really actually get to practice some of the things that are that are coming out in your book.
Yeah.
So I know you've been, getting ready to birth this book actually for years, but what, aside from Cuddle Party, what led to the book and who is the book targeted towards? Who's the audience?
So the book is targeted to educators, primarily of middle and high school students and educators and support staff, with a secondary market of teachers and consent educators, generally speaking, including people who work with adults. That being said, I wish I could take like the second 2/3 of the book and just give it to literally everyone, because the first part is like very like, here's how to set up your container and how to, things to watch out for in your room and, mandatory disclose, mandatory reporting kind of stuff. And then the rest of it is like literally everybody this applies to.
Right.
So the book is technically targeted to educators of young people, but I've been teaching this to adults for a long time. The way the book came about is my co-author, Erica Scott. She found Cuddle Party, I forget what year, 2015, 2016, something like that, became a Cuddle Party facilitator. She had a huge epiphany. She is a mom. She is a sexual abuse survivor. She did not have a background in this at all professionally. She just was like, oh my God, I really want people to have access to these boundary tools, because as a sexual assault survivor, sexual abuse survivor, it kind of blew her mind when she first encountered my work. But she was really passionate about taking a lot of the exercises and contexts, removing it from the cuddling and making it accessible to young people. And also making it accessible to audiences that are maybe not as sophisticated as your patrons, people who are a little bit intimidated by even talking about consent or sex or cuddling or any neo-tantra, any of this stuff. So she was really interested in pushing it to a broader audience and making it more accessible. And she approached me and was like, hey, do you mind if I take some of your work and experiment in some workshops? I was like, great, go ahead. And then she came back to me about a year or two later and was like, will you write a book with me? And I'm like, if you can project manage me, then yes. And so that's how the book kind of came to be. And I'm really excited about it.
And I've noticed even from some mutual friends of ours, I'm thinking of Heather, who are already reading the book, and are parents, for example. Like I get lectured. It's so funny how I'm about to age myself here or date myself, but my teenage son, he's always like, Mom, consent. Like he's 15 and he already knows about the concept of consent. I didn't understand that at 15. Yeah. I also had this black and white yes or no, but it's a very interesting, even as a sex educator myself, and as a neo-tantric where it's all about honoring the other person. As this mom, I used to wipe his butt. So I've had access and agency to his body, and now he's a teenager, and he's right. He is like schooling me. I think he's kind of using it a little manipulatively these days.
Yeah, sure.
But, you know, I really think it's an important resource as well for parents and all of us. You know, there are many people on the call that I know move in sex positive spaces. And so often we assume that people are good at it. And really, that is not the case. It's part of why you'll actually be happy to hear that in one of the, I'm going to name it because I was so impressed, the moderator of a huge neo-tantra group called Let's Talk Tantra said, please, he's in South Africa, please come back and tell us the highlights. So I'm going to be sending some of your, you've made some great graphics and things. So I'll be sharing that there, because sometimes we assume people know.
Right.
And I remember hanging out at a sex positive polyamorous event, and people were just coming up and putting their arm around me. Now, you know, that's not a huge boundary violation, but I'm so sensitive energetically that when somebody touches me, that actually takes about 80% of my attention. And it takes me out of the conversation I'm having. And I'm quite particular about who touches my body and where they touch me. So even though it was totally non-sexual, I was like, could you ask?
Yeah.
And I love hugging. I'm a hugger, but not everybody is.
Right.
I have a friend who's a yoga teacher, and she's like, I hate this California hugging culture.
I have a whole section about the California yummy hug in the book.
Oh, well, let's speak to that, because I teach this whole practice of hugging. I think hugging is wonderful. I'm sure I'm not the only one missing hugging in their life right now. Right. But can you just speak to a little bit about what's in that chapter? Because
so that's in the chapter about called When is the Hug Over? And I talked about how when I moved to California, 13 years ago from New York, and I'd been to Burning Man, I'd been to LA a lot, and you know, I didn't quite, nothing quite had prepared. I had been doing Cuddle Party at this point for 4 years. So I'd been cuddling strangers for 4 years. Nothing prepared me for the California yummy hug, which is the thing that people in sort of new age and festival and dance cultures where they're just like, and polyculture, like there's just this sort of, not everybody like on the street, but people in these subcultures will kind of like, they're like, take a deep breath. It's like they went to too many tantra classes and then forgot that not everybody's into neo tantra, you know? So like they take a deep breath and they like hug you, and then they go, and I'm like, what is happening? And then they like don't let go, and you're just like, I feel like a trapped bird. I was a yes at the beginning, and now you're still hugging me. And then they do this thing where like after they're done hugging you, and like they don't pick up the signals when, you know, you're like trying to get out of it, and then they'll do the thing where they'll like take a step back, but they'll like hold onto your hands or hold onto your shoulders and like eye gaze with you, and again, and I'm like, that was entirely too much intimacy for just meeting you, or like just running into you, or like you're a random person I know from a party, right?
Yeah,
I haven't had one of those in a couple of years because pandemic, but yeah, exactly. There's like this like, did I give you permission to feed off of me? And sometimes that is energy and sometimes it's not, but it's like this cultural thing. And so I talk about like, you know, with consent, like both people don't have to agree that the interaction is over. One person wanting an interaction to be over is enough for it to be, it's time for it to be over. And so now I have a whole, like, I'm a little bit more aggressive and disengaging. And when people like do the hand holding, or like, I'll just take a step back and like put my hands in between, or I'll take their hands and use my arms as sort of like stiff. I'm a bit more aggressive in protecting my boundary. And I don't feel bad about it because, hey, you're coming at me with this intensity. I'm just going to meet you with the same level of intensity with my boundary, and that's fine. But I like cracked myself up writing that chapter because everybody I've mentioned the California yummy hug to, in California at least, basically has just cracked up. They're like, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yep. Well, I love this pulling away, like the hug is over when one or however many people you have in the hug depending on which California community, right? That you honor it at that. And I've actually learned, I work with a lot of trauma survivors, actually to even ask, are you open to sharing a hug?
Yeah.
Because for some people, they're actually a no. So you could put them, we're going to talk about trauma in a moment, but yeah, you could put somebody in a really defensive space and make them feel quite unsafe by even just assuming. So if you come at them with the arms, like you're already halfway into the hug. And an adjustment I've had to make, and this is for the energy geeks amongst us, that sometimes, and I'm quite a fan of those yummy, long dropped-in hugs, as long as it's consensual. But you also don't want to like penetrate the person energetically. Like you can actually be violating, I'm using strong words, but violating somebody's space, even just in a hug. And those are strong words, but we really want to look at how we're engaging and how we're interacting.
I want to address this comment in a minute, but before we do, one of the things we do in that as an exercise for young people, but again, this is where I feel like it really isn't just for young people. It's, workshop facilitators, anybody who is, working with anybody around this stuff. We have a whole exercise, because the way the book is structured is each chapter, the beginning is sort of like, here's how to set it up. And then each chapter is sort of explaining some core concepts and then explaining how to teach it. And then at the end is like the workshop all the way straight through, just so you can like literally read it. And then in that chapter, one of the things we have people do is like actually learn, like pay attention to body language and practice like how, like what can you notice? And there's a whole exercise in how to do that. And I feel like a lot of neo-tantra communities and dance communities and people who like hang out with the California Yummy Hug could probably benefit from doing some of those exercises. Just because I want to be dropped in doesn't mean you want to be dropped in to that level. And like you said, it could be kind of violating and kind of intense.
Yeah. So you
there's a really interesting
giving and receiving.
Yeah.
I know that's right up your alley.
I'm going to do a shout out to Betty Martin's work, because I feel like this is exactly the crux of her work around the wheel of consent, which is what we teach in the School of Consent. And this is like more, much more nuanced geek and adult training around giving and receiving. The subtitle of the book is The Art of Receiving and Giving. But this whole thing of like, who is it for? Which we do talk a little bit about in here in our book. Who is this for? Like, is the hug for them? If it is, am I giving it as a gift, or am I tolerating and enduring? Or is it for me? In which case, am I getting exactly what I want? Or do I need to make a request for something to be different? Like maybe I want to move my arm, or maybe I want to be held and not hold back, like not be holding the other person back, and I just want to be held. So that clarity of who is this for is kind of the crux. And that's the Wheel of Consent, and all of Betty's work is really a somatic exploration of who is it for, and is this a gift I'm giving with a full heart, or where am I falling into tolerating, enduring, and going along with, which we do talk about. We actually do have a whole section of distinguishing those somewhere in here. I don't remember exactly which chapter. But we have a whole thing about what the difference and how it feels different to have something you want. Like, this is your desire. Like, I want to go see that movie. I want to hug you, versus willing, like wholeheartedly willing, like, yeah, I want to go to the movies. I don't really care if it's that movie. That sounds good, versus like tolerating or enduring, which is like, oh, if I say no, they're going to get mad, or they're going to feel sad. So I guess I better say yes. Or I'm worried about the negative consequences if I say no, and therefore I'm going to say yes. And that's more in the tolerating and enduring. Or where you start as a yes, like, I'm really happy to give you a hug, and now it's a yummy hug, and I'm here longer than I want to be. And it switches from, I was a wholehearted willing, and now I am tolerating and enduring. So
just reading some of the comments. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm just going to comment without reading the whole comment. I like this invitation that can be created by saying, would you like to share a hug? It's languaging I learned from HI, the Human Awareness Institute. But it gives the person the option to say no, right? And in the comments, the person is suggesting like, would you like to share a hug with me? And I guess, I mean, you could play out even just playing with these questions, perhaps even like creating your own workshop, but just practicing what it's like this is something you do at Cuddle Party, right? Practicing what it's like to receive a no, what it's like to give a no. And you have an awesome graphic that you made years ago, I think on Canva or something, but ways to say no. That I end up sharing it on social media
maybe later,
quite regularly, because it's like, personally, I have my own rejection issues, so I don't happen to like the word no, but you can also negotiate for something that you do want, like, no, I'm not available to hug you right now, but you want to go and get some food at the potluck and we could sit and eat together. So you're just choosing what works for you. And I noticed what you said, Marcia, even about this like enduring. And it's very interesting how that can tie into, it isn't always, but can tie into this fawning response, which is another trauma response, which we're going to talk about trauma in a little while. But if somebody's had their boundaries violated repeatedly, which often happens for trauma survivors, even just having somebody be okay with not having to receive the hug that you so desperately want to give them, that can be huge.
Yeah. And it's like, you want to give it, but is that for you or is it for them? Because if it's for them and they don't want it, then if it's for them and they don't want it, then don't give it to them. Like, don't give people gifts they don't want. If it's for you, own it. Right. And another thing we talk about in the book is a concept that I'm very fond of, that I came up with in 2014, called desire smuggling, which is all the things we do to get our desires fulfilled when we don't feel like we can or know how to ask for them directly. And some of them are really innocuous, just not very effective, like hoping it'll happen, or hinting, or flirting, or, they're not necessarily toxic, they're just maybe not effective. Some of them are kind of self-sabotaging or harmful to the other person. Desire smuggling. So this is kind of an umbrella term I use to describe all the things, like all the huge range of behaviors we do to try to get what we want, even though we don't know how to ask for it. So, the innocuous, but maybe not very effective ones. And then there's the sort of self-sabotaging or sabotaging the relationship, like you're passive aggressive, or you kind of like make deals in your head, but don't tell the other person you're like bargaining, or you're sort of like snappy or judgmental or a little bit aggressive in trying to like get what you want. And then there's like the outright toxic antisocial stuff, right? You just steal it, you take it, you assault people, you rape people. Like, that's a third category that would fall under that umbrella. And, desire smuggling, individual behaviors can be like innocuous or toxic, but desire smuggling as a category, the way I tend to think about it is, when someone, myself or someone else, is smuggling a desire, and you can often tell not what the desire is, but you can see the behavior. It's a clue. It's a clue that you want something. It's a clue that the other person wants something. That doesn't mean you have to give it to them. Doesn't mean they have to give it to you, but it can be a valuable thing if you're somebody who has a hard time knowing what you want or that you want. One of the things you can do is start to learn your particular desire smuggling tendencies. So, for example, one of my really common ones is I play options roulette, where like I'll give 3 options and one of them is the one that I secretly want, but I don't want to own it, or I don't want you to feel pressured, or whatever the thing is. And so I give you 3 options, 2 that I can live with, 1 that I really want, and then I let you choose. Totally innocuous desire smuggling. But I could be honest with myself and with the other person that I want something, and just, be like, hey, I actually want to go see that movie, or actually I want sushi for dinner. Actually, could you just rub my feet? And it's a practice. Like, so much of this is practice. And, like I said, a lot of this stuff is content that I developed working with adults, working with people who have, kind of alternative relationship styles, alternative sexualities, who are not doing things in the mainstream and who are looking to develop language to talk about their desires. But the fact of the matter is we live in a very coercive culture that is steeped in shame. And so these skills are relevant for everybody. And the fun thing about working with young people is, if we can teach them some of these things early on, maybe they can avoid some of the shame, and maybe they can avoid some of the shitty coercive situations, because they've learned to identify, hey, that was not super consensual, or hey, that was actually manipulative, or hey, that's bullying. Name calling is a really big thing. When people say, oh, you're so selfish, or you're so lazy, or you're so aggressive, or you're such a bitch, you're such a fill in the blank. All those words mean is you are not convenient to me the way you are. So
I have to watch that on my social media, especially these days. I'm like, you can share your opinion, but you can't insult the other people on this thread. If you can share your opinion respectfully, you're welcome to share. Otherwise, yeah. I want to stick with desire smuggling, and I have seen the other question. We'll come to that in a moment. But I grew up in a family where it actually wasn't safe to ask for what I want. Like, it literally wasn't safe. And so I was dating somebody recently, and he kept saying to me, just ask me directly. And I know inside what I want. That's not hard. I've spent years cultivating that. But actually, and I'm somebody who's pretty empowered in general around speaking my voice, and it's really hard. So the way that I ask, and I mean, I know we've been in business meetings, we're like, Caroline, are you noticing your desire smuggling? But it's good, because we don't always realize. And I will ask in such a roundabout way that the person doesn't even know that I've made a request. It's vulnerable to ask directly. So what are some of the tools that you would recommend, say, for somebody like me who, like, I have a not that I want to like lean into my trauma too much, but I have a very real, and most people do, right, have a real world reason where they don't just come out and say, I want to go and see, this happened on my very first date. The guy was so sweet. I was like, I don't know, 8 or 9. Oh, you're like, but it's hard to say no. Yes.
It's hard to say no, and
asking for what you want is hard. It is hard. Yeah. And I will be coming to the questions, I promise, in a moment.
So, I mean, we do talk about this in the book, and we try to talk about it in a way that is like, this is a 101 book. This is not a comprehensive, perfect for all scenarios. Here's how to navigate your specific nuanced trauma situation. But, the first thing is starting with just acknowledging that the world is not friendly to desire. Desire is this like really precious, tender thing. And the world is not like, the world moves fast. People are clumsy. Even if they don't mean to shut you down, they might. And sometimes they do mean to shut you down. Like, I think it's really important to just acknowledge the truth of that. One of the things we talk about in the book is the importance of cultivating warm, safe havens for one another. And that, when we slow down, when we listen, when we pause to hear what's actually going on for the other person, it starts to cultivate spaces where it starts to feel safer to ask, right? And trust me, I spent my entire career helping people ask for what they want, and usually it's one of two things. They don't know what they want because they've never had the space to think about it or consider it, often because it wasn't safe to ask, so why bother figuring it out? Or like you, they have done the work to figure it out, and to like notice their patterns. But then there is this like, but is it actually safe to ask? And one of the things that I've noticed, not just in holding workshop containers, but also in by cultivating colleagues, with, you know, people is like, whoa, it seems like you want something, like, let's pause for that, you know, which you've heard me do a million times in business meetings.
Yeah.
Like, it seems like there's something there. Let's just have a minute. And like, you've gotten very emotional at times with that, and not to put you on the spot, but you already talked about it. So
That's okay. Yeah.
And you're not the only person. And I think that like, when we make space for other people to just have an opportunity, whether or not they even take it. Like, it's not that we all have to say what we want all the time. It's that making room for desire really makes, like, it starts to undo some of that patterning, you know. And again, our goal with this book is to catch people younger, you know, an earlier stage where they don't have as much trauma built up and as many shitty experiences, ideally, or to at least give a sense of a possibility of it being different, so that when those crappy experiences happen and you do feel shut down by people, there's a sense of another world is possible, another place is possible, there's a different way of relating that's at least possible, even if it feels hard to find or rare. I know it's out there, versus just giving up, which is what a lot of people do.
Mm-hmm. And I'd love it if you can speak to this, like, I might be using my own words instead of the way you phrased it so brilliantly in the book, but like negotiating for the where you both winning, where both people, because there's somebody sharing, you know, about what if you do get vulnerable and ask for what you want and then you hear a no. So I like this idea, like, you know, that you can still find this place of yes. So can you, for both of you, you may not get the exact thing that you've asked for. You might even get something better.
Right.
How do you and I do this in our friendship all the time, and I love it.
Let's take a step back, actually. And I actually want to give, because we haven't actually given a definition of consent in this.
Great.
So a lot of people, when they think about consent, there's somebody asking, there's somebody saying yes or no. And one person has the thing, the other person wants the thing, or the perception is that one person has the thing. In the sort of classic sexual consent model that a lot of us were handed, it's like the woman has this, first of all, everybody's heterosexual and monogamous. The woman has the sex and the man wants the sex, and the man's pursuing the woman to get the sex, and he's just asking. And her job is to say yes or no. She's a gatekeeper. So I call this the gatekeeper model of consent. And in the gatekeeper model of consent, what's basically happening is one person is asking permission, which is not bad. It's just incomplete. It's an incomplete model of consent. The way that I like to think of consent is creating an agreement, and it's an ongoing creation of an agreement about how we want to play together, how we want to share space together, how we want to be together. So instead of one person asking and the other person just saying yes or no, which might be sufficient for some interactions. Hey, will you get me a cookie? Yes. Or can I have one of your cookies? Yes. You know, it might look more like, you know, I would love to hang out with you, but I need it to be quiet because I need to focus on work. Oh, cool. Yeah, I totally want to hang out, but I do want to have this conversation. So can we work for a couple of hours and then talk about that? And I'll wear my headphones and you can wear your headphones. Like, you're brainstorming, you're coming up with a collaborative way to be together, how to share space. And this is where also consent is about so much more than just sex. Like, it's really about all of the interactions that we have together, finding mutually agreeable ways. And then it's an ongoing creation of agreements. So that requires us to start to notice what we want kind of ongoingly. One of the things that does, though, is it lowers the stakes each time you ask, because you're not like saving it all up for the one big ask because it's the only chance you get and they might say yes or no. When you're using an agreement model of consent rather than a permission model, or as we frame it in the book, we're starting to use a collaborative model rather than a gatekeeper model. You know, as children, the adults in our lives are kind of the gatekeepers, and they have the things and we want the things, and we don't really have a lot of agency. As adults, we can make lots of asks. We can make lots of minor asks. And one of the things I'm constantly telling my students is ask for a lot, ask often, ask when the stakes are low. Because then there's just kind of a constant flow. But also listen, you know, it's not just, you're not only putting output, you're also synthesizing what you're getting and then go, oh, well, what if we did it this way? Or how about that? And then kind of negotiating. And this might sound hard until you realize kids do this on the playground all the time. Like children know how to do this. Let's play tag. You be it. No, I don't want to be it. Okay, I'll be it. Oh no, the tree's base. No, I want the jungle gym to be base. Like they just sort of throw things out and create agreements, and then they have disagreements and they stop playing, and then they come back and they figure out a new agreement about how they want to play. So we know how to do this. It's just that we forget, or we start to take it really seriously, or we think we don't have a right to it, and we do have a right to it.
And I think also starting with someone, you know, where it feels easy, where you already have a good relationship with them, where you feel safe enough to ask, and you can be like, I'm going to be practicing. I say this lately because sometimes the way I do tend to wait until I'm like really desperate for the thing, and then it comes out as a demand. And so I'm working on this in my personal life. My teachers are on my ass about this. Anyway, but practicing that muscle with people that feel safe versus going to your boss and asking for a raise, like that's super intimidating. Or maybe it's intimidating to ask somebody out on a date. Like whatever is the super intimidating thing, when you building that muscle, go to like your best friend. And I've actually been doing this throughout the pandemic. I remember asking to pot up with a friend, and I don't live in the Bay Area anymore. So when I come back to the Bay, I've got to find somewhere to stay. And it's a much bigger conversation these days. And we're practicing being able to say yes and no to each other. And sometimes the yes is, yes, you can stay in my house and you have to wear a mask the whole time you're in communal space. I was totally fine with that versus the black and white of no, you can't stay because it's not safe.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So we've been sort of hinting at trauma, and I do just want to spend a couple of moments honoring that, because some people have a sense of what trauma is. But can you speak, for example, I've referenced the Fawn Response. Can you speak very briefly what happens or what it looks like when people go into freeze? Because most of us have heard of fight and flight, but what does freeze look like?
So freeze is not necessarily a trauma response as much as it is a response to perceived danger, which the perception may come from trauma, or it may be just there's a fucking tiger coming at you. So fight or flight are sort of the two that researchers recognized early on, but in their autonomic responses, they happen in 15 milliseconds within it's not a decision. We don't make a decision to fight or run. And we also don't make a decision to freeze, but it took a little while longer for us to realize it. So you see this a lot it's very, very common with sexual assault that people will freeze. And then afterwards they'll say things, or other people will say things like, why didn't you fight? Why didn't you run? Why didn't you yell? As though it was a decision. And I think this is such a key thing for people to understand about consent, is that it's not that Marcia, in my fully conscious mind, have assessed the situation thoughtfully and have decided that there is danger and then made a choice about what I'm going to do about it. Is that my brain made a split-second decision and did one of the three things that mammals do. We run, we fight, or we play dead, right? And playing dead doesn't necessarily mean that, which is the freeze response, doesn't necessarily mean that we can't talk, but usually we can't form complex sentences. We might respond slower. Our ability to form memories is impacted when this happens. And like we just are not functioning. So even if on the outside it looks like we're still there, especially if it's a new partner, if it's somebody that doesn't know you very well, they may not actually even catch that you're in a freeze response, but it doesn't, like it's all wrong. And the other thing we know is that once someone has experienced the freeze response as a response to perceived or actual danger, there are 70% more, that's the wrong statistic. 70% of sexual assault survivors are likely to experience the freeze response again. That's the 70%. So it's really common. If you've experienced it once, you'll experience it again. It's very, very common in sexual assault, because typically when sexual assault is happening frequently, it starts by a larger human when we're young, like when we're children, or if we're not when we're children, it's still somebody who's bigger physically or more powerfully socially, or both. So freeze response is also very common when there's a big animal, you don't move and you hope they don't hurt you. And I really want people to understand that. And it's just starting to be recognized in the legal system that, hey, the reason she didn't fight or yell is because her brain kicked in with this third thing that is actually really, really common. You may also hear about the Fawn response. And the Fawn response is different than the other three. So fight, flight, and freeze are autonomic responses that happen in 15 milliseconds and are not decisions. The Fawn response is a learned response, and it's typically a trauma response of people pleasing and just saying yes and going along with it, because it makes, usually there's been a situation where if you don't go along with it, you get hurt. And so that's a learned trauma response. And it's also really helpful for people to know about that in a sexual context, because what that looks like is they can't say no to you. And so one of the things when I'm coaching people who are like, well, how do I make sure I'm not a violator? I don't, especially when I'm working with men, but really anybody who doesn't. Dominants also come to me with this question. I'm going to be talking on Sinclair Sexsmith's Patreon soon about next month about dominance and consent and how to like navigate that. But the two things I say, you need to be able to recognize is, can this person say no to you, which is checking for the Fawn response? And what does it look like if they go silent? What does it look like when they're silent because it's good? And what does it look like when they're silent because it's bad? Like, because some of us were like, we're about to have an orgasm and we go really quiet, and that's not the same thing. But like when you're in sort of a more running the fuck, let's say, situation where you're the dominant, you're the lead, you're the masculine holding this container, whatever the thing is. It's a useful thing to be able to tell what a Fawn response looks like and what a freeze response looks like in your partners.
And they can be so subtle.
They can, because sometimes it's just dissociation.
Right. Well, I think that's going to be a little bit beyond the scope of this, of our discussion tonight. But I remember I feel really blessed that through polyamory and kink, I actually learned to negotiate a lot of things pretty well up front. And I'm learning in the pandemic, people do not have those skills just as a baseline. Like I'll negotiate to dinner and we're going to meet in this context that I feel comfortable with. And then I show up and they're like, oh, I just changed it. And I'm like, that doesn't work for me. I didn't say yes to that. But I remember negotiating a lovely threesome once at a play party, and I'd had my STI conversation and I was very excited. It was with two men, and off we went to play. And at one point, they just beckoned more people to come in. I thank you for your response, Marcia, because I was horrified, but I couldn't find my voice to say anything.
Yeah.
I was in such a state of shock, and I don't even have every other kind of trauma, but no sexual trauma. And the only way I could find my voice was to physically and it took me about 10 minutes, which is a long time if you're feeling really uncomfortable. But I just physically.
But very common when it's a freeze response because you're frozen.
Right. And I was comfortable with the two people I'd negotiated with, but I didn't even know these other people. And suddenly they're in this engagement. And I was able to physically get my body up and move. And that was how I, communicated what I needed to.
Yeah.
I'm just sharing that just in case there are people watching, like losing one's voice or going into freeze, as you're saying, can happen for super empowered people.
Oh, yeah.
Can happen in a range of situations.
Mm-hmm.
And if the words can't come, like I've now learned to pre-negotiate if I'm going into any group dynamics, I'm like, I need a verbal yes from every single person in the interaction, including me if we're inviting somebody else in.
Yeah.
And that was just something I had to learn. So
I want to just say something here. Consent is not a magic wand. We can consent to things that are a terrible idea for us. We can consent to things that are traumatizing. We can consent to like just bad ideas. Like I have consented to all kinds of stuff that after the fact I was like, well, that was a terrible idea and I'm a little bit fucked up about it, to be honest. And simultaneously with that, like consent accidents happen, like misunderstandings happen, people don't understand, like I thought you meant this, I'm so sorry. Or things just, there's blind spots that you don't think to cover it. Like now you know to negotiate the verbal yes. You didn't think about that at the time. Like it doesn't occur to us that we have to have those conversations. So we actually also have a whole thing about how to do repair and how to have apologies, because I really want to get away from this idea that consent means it's automatically a good experience and no consent means it's automatically a bad experience. That's just not true. You can have non-consensual things that end up being fine or great even. We didn't negotiate it. It just worked out. We were lucky. You can also have things that are completely, I've had entire relationships that were completely consensual in the sense that I agreed to things and we had ongoing conversations, but I didn't know what I needed. I didn't know what was bad for me. I didn't know what my options really were because I was young and hadn't lived enough. And it took me like several years to recover from some of those experiences. So it's not that consent fixes everything. It's that when things go sideways, there's also some mechanisms in place for recovery, for repair, for apologies, for accountability. And we talk about that in the book as well. We have a whole thing about restorative justice. We have a whole thing about like how to apologize. So like there's some pretty hefty concepts in here for young people, but I don't think this is stuff that kids don't need to know about. I think like learning how to take responsibility when you screw up or when you cross somebody's boundary. Like we live in such a carceral, punitive society where we become afraid to take responsibility. Part of consent culture is being able to apologize and like mean it and like also give space for people to not accept your apology, and that's okay too. Like people are allowed to say no, right? And so, but to make it such that it gets talked about, it's not just swept under the rug when it consent, because consent accidents are gonna happen even with people who are trying. It's just true. And we're gonna consent to things that are just terrible ideas. Like, why did I say yes to that? So consent culture is not so much I don't think of it as like Dumbo's magic feather, right? Like it's not like a thing that like if you have it, everything you can fly. Like it's, maybe that's not the right analogy, but it makes it such that we're more likely to have smooth interactions going into things. We're more likely that everybody's going to get what they want. We're more likely to be able to recover well because we're pausing, we're listening, we're respecting boundaries, we're asking for what we want, we're saying yes, we're saying no, and we're not just going along with things because we don't feel like we have a choice. Will crap still happen? Yeah, but we can do it. We can have it feel less crappy.
Right. And you hinting at this, but I like this idea that consent is an ongoing thing. Just because you've said yes to something doesn't mean, like, if you find your no, you get to change your mind. I see this happen actually quite frequently when I run. Oh, great.
Your mind.
I haven't even, and we need to get to your book in a minute. And I also want to share that we're going to open the floor up for questions from our participants in a second. But how, how we might have been a yes to something, and then we get to change our mind and say, actually, I thought I was good to do this tonight, or I thought I was up for this cool thing, but actually I'm noticing I'm feeling a little tender right now, and I just need
Or you can start it and change your mind and be full, or I thought this was going to last 5 minutes and here we are 20 minutes later and I'm done. Or context really affects our boundaries.
I love actually creating time limits. Like, we can think of it even at having family, let's pick a tricky one, having family come and stay at your home, or friends come and stay at your home. Yes, you can come and crash on my couch for 2 days. And after that, we can check in and see where we're at. I learned this after having my brother and 8 of his friends crashing, I'm not kidding, for like 3 weeks in my living room when I was in my 20s in London. And I was like, I wanted to be so generous.
Well, and this is where we get ourselves into trouble, is we want to be generous, but then we don't ever build in checkpoints. And when we have that option to opt in again and again and again, then we have a choice, and we can see what our resources are and what we can give with, as Betty Martin says, with a full heart, versus, well, shit, I said yes, and now I'm stuck with this decision for 3 weeks.
Right. Yeah, I never did that again.
Yeah.
Actually. So your book is coming out on Friday. Now that you've given us this, you've whet our appetites for the book, how do we find it? How do we go and get our hands on a copy?
Well, you can just go to Amazon and Google it there, but you can also go to creatingconsentculture.com. That's my co-author's website, and she's got all the links there. You can order it directly from the publisher. You can order it from bookstore.org. You can, or if you're in Canada, you can order it from Indigo if you basically don't want to support the Bezos monster. It's been a very weird thing to be like, we're #1 on Amazon, also fuck Amazon. But it's been a whole thing as an author. It's a tricky thing, but we'll take wherever sales you want to buy it from. I'm happy. JKP is our publisher, Jessica Kingsley Press. They've been wonderful. They publish a lot of educational books on all kinds of things. And, one of the things we talked about in the book was acknowledging when consent has been violated is so important. One of the things we did, and we didn't know how the publisher was going to react, is we wanted to do land acknowledgements for the land that as my co-author and I are both white, and we were like, and she's Canadian, so it's like an even bigger conversation up there. But we wanted to do a land acknowledgement for the land that we were writing the book on, and we were like, let's ask the publisher if they're willing to do that, and they actually were. Then they wrote a whole little thing too, just again to model we can talk about it when consent has been violated. It's actually important to talk about it when consent has been violated. Even if we can't fix it, we can acknowledge that it's real, it happened, and it's messed up. You are now muted somehow.
Thank you. I plugged my computer in, which I haven't done before we started, and it muted me. I'm really passionate about there being a way, when there's been some kind of overreach or even a violation, for there to be a way for people to walk back into integrity.
Yeah.
Because for me, integrity is not that we're perfect all the time. We're all very human and very flawed.
And learning.
But for there to be a way, and I think I'm so excited that this is actually addressed in the book. I can't wait to read it myself, because there has to be a way. Otherwise, it's also not safe for people to come forward and go, I fucked up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
There has to be a way to acknowledge that. And accountability, not punishment. Sometimes accountability is really uncomfortable. I've been privy to some accountability processes that have been really a lot of work for the person who needed to deal with the thing. But there's something really powerful when it's not punitive, when it's not about, I'm going to get back at you for that. It's, I screwed up and I am going to take some steps to, even if I can't fix it with the person I hurt, that I don't make that mistake again in the future, or I don't make that kind of mistake, or that I see what my blind spots are because this was how I was raised and I want to do better, or whatever the thing is.
I love one day I called you up. I'm like, Marcia, we've got to clear something. And I was like, you may not even remember what it was. I don't even remember what it was. But it was amazing because I came to the conversation quite fired up, and I had misheard something that you had said in a meeting. Oh, it was about sharing emotions in a meeting. And I'm like, it's really important to me that we get to share emotions in a meeting. And you're like, I didn't say that. And there was nothing for me, like just even approaching you to do this clearing. There's a video on my YouTube channel for those of you that are curious about what clearing means. I can put it on Patreon for you guys as well. But that like took all the fire out of everything, because you were just communicating so clearly. You're like, this is what I said, and I just misremembered. It was like the easiest clearing.
I remember that conversation.
So we have talked about some things that could be activating for people. So I'm just going to invite us, before we move into the questions portion, let's all just take a breath together. The world's an intense place right now. Some of this could be activating for people. So wherever you are, let's take a rich breath in and a big sigh out. I like to open the jaws so we can activate the vagus nerve. Inhale. If you're willing, you can look weird with me and stick your tongue out.
It does feel good.
That's what, sorry?
It does feel good.
It does feel good. I feel myself landing.
Yeah.
In Elvis again. So I'm going to be handing the reins over to our delightful participants. And just for some who may have joined us late, you can choose to ask questions a few different ways. You can let's do it by raised hands on Zoom. If you want to come on camera and ask a question, you could put it in the chat. I won't reference your name if you put it in the chat. Or you could message me privately if you don't feel safe enough, or if you just don't want anybody to know it's you asking the question. Notice how we're creating options for people to feel safe, to be able to ask for what they want.
Choice, to have choice.
And have choice, yes.
A key part of all of this.
So yeah, we're going to make time probably just for the next 15 minutes. So if there's something that
there was a question that came in that
I'm about to go back and so the question that I saw in the chat earlier, the person reflected, being conscious of one's own feelings and desires seems to be a very good idea, right? Sounds easy, not always. To what extent in real life, in the moment interaction with one other or many others, is it good to state these things out loud? And this came in the context of our discussion around desire smuggling.
Mm-hmm. I love this question because the answer is it depends. But so I think there's as with many interaction questions, it's a bit of a dance, right? How much intimacy do you have with this person? How much intimacy do you want with this person? Do you tend to share a lot? Do you tend to share a little? If you're somebody who tends to share a little and you are wanting more intimacy, where's the other person at? Are they open to hearing this kind of information? Do they know how to hold it? So if you're like, I don't tend to share a lot, I want to be more intimate, and this person has expressed that they would like to hear more from me, you should probably share that a lot, whatever is going on with your feelings. If you are somebody who sometimes shares a lot, sometimes doesn't, can get really kind of oversharey or clammed up, depending on the situation, what have you just been doing? And like check against, like, have I been saying a lot? Have I been like letting the other person share, or have I been kind of Undersharing, so kind of doing an assessment. If you don't know, it's always great to just ask the other person, like, would you like to hear what I'm thinking? Would you like to hear what I'm feeling? I really like the question framing of would you like, because it's about what they want. Just be careful you're not desire smuggling. Like, I really want to share with you, so I'm going to ask you if you want, and then I'm going to pressure you, right? But if you are wanting to know where the other person's at, or whether it's quote unquote good to state these things out loud, as the question was framed, good is what works for the two of you. So if it works for the two of you, sometimes it's worth pausing and having a meta conversation. Sometimes you can just test the water by sharing and see how they react. Sometimes you can share, see how they react, and then have a check-in later. Depends on the relationship you have with this person. Like if it's a first date, it's going to feel really different than if it's like your best friend or your lover. As a general, this is a guideline that I have used in my life when there's something that I want to share, really kind of any kind. I go by the rule of 3. Like if I've thought about it 3 times, I should probably just tell them so I can stop ruminating. Your mileage may vary, but I've found that to work pretty well. Does that sort of, I don't want to name names, but the person who asked that question, does that actually get at what you were hoping for? Great. Awesome. Yay.
I want to just drop in a Neo-Tantra tool that can be helpful for that. Mm-hmm. So sometimes just having it built in, like, I'm really into ritual, but okay, so let's create the ritual and we're going to engage some kind of touch. There's a sort of a formula, I guess, or a ritual of sharing your fears, your boundaries, and your desires. And what I like about that structure is, there's just this thing we're going to do. Everybody's going to, everybody in the interaction is going to do it. So it's not weird. Mm-hmm. And that's a way, like sharing your desires is not like, I have to have this happen. Mm-hmm. I've heard it also, I don't know who to attribute this to. So Marcia, if you know, but I've heard it shared in the play party community. What is the mildest thing you want to happen? And what is the wildest thing
I like that.
You want to happen? And I remember the first time I heard that, I thought it was brilliant, because the mildest thing is, I want to hang up with some great people. And the wildest can be pretty wild, but it can also give people an opportunity to go, that person's into this thing I know. So sharing, or this thing that I might be interested in exploring, or I was hoping someone would ask for that. So the communication piece, I think, really makes a huge difference. And I dated somebody we have in common, a mutual friend, Marcia, that each time in 5 years this person showed up for a date, they would say, even though they knew me very well, we dated for 5 years, what are you interested in exploring today? Mm-hmm. That was such a refreshing question. And it actually created a lot of amazing variety in our play together. So there are ways you can create this scenario for being able to express, this is what I want, this is what they want, and then negotiating for their win.
So going back to the previous thing, when I was responding, do they know how to hold it? So there's a question of, do I trust them or can I give them a try? And I think, again, it goes back to the relationship. And also trust. I want to speak to trust. This is sort of outside the realm of consent, but it's, I think, a really important thing. A lot of times we think of trust as a binary, like I trust them or I don't trust them. And I think it's really useful to approach the question of trust 2 ways. One, do I trust them for this thing? So it's like not a general, do I trust them? It's like, do I trust them for this thing? I have people in my life, I don't trust them for very many things, but I know they'll always show up on time. Or I know that, like, if you want them to, do anything that they say they're going to do in a non-crisis situation, it's 50-50 chance of whether you're going to get what you want. But if, like, you're on the way to the hospital, they're the person you want there. Like, so trust is a very strange thing. Not strange, but like it can be a No, it's not a binary in that regard. The other thing about trust is how much do I trust them on this thing? So like on a scale of 1 to 10, like I would I would surrender, in a heartbeat on this thing. Like I trust them to hold my emotions without taking it personally. Maybe you trust them a 10, and that could be because you are very trusting and they are very trustworthy. And so that has worked out. Or it could be that you're very trusting and you haven't tested them yet and you might get dropped, but you're okay with being dropped. Or it could be that you're not very trusting, but they've demonstrated over and over and over and over and over again that they're reliable for that thing. So that trust question is an interesting one. And then, or do you give them a try? Sometimes giving people a try is how you build the trust. So
you can also try with something when the stakes are low, like let's go out to dinner on Friday night at 8:00. And if they can at this place, and if they can agree to that and meet with that, right. And then you can slowly build up from there. You don't have to hand them the keys or the deed to your house.
Right. I mean, similarly, like one of the things I'm constantly telling my students to do is test people with smaller boundaries and see how they respond. How somebody responds when they're not getting what they want on a low stakes level is going to tell you how they're going to respond when the stakes are higher, or at least give you some information about it. Right. And people are always like, well, how do I do that? I'm like, set an inconsequential boundary that if they cross the boundary, it's not actually going to harm you. But a lot of us, and this is again, not in the consent book, but this is a thing I'm really passionate about teaching is, a lot of us set our boundaries right next to our limits. So that when our boundary is crossed, our limit is also crossed. This is a thing I talk about in my Better Boundaries crash course, which if you go to my website, askingforwhatyouwant.com, you can download that. It's related to consent in that we have to know how to communicate our boundaries. But I'm always advising my students, set your boundaries further out and then adjust them according to context, adjust them based on how they respond, and give yourself room, give you and them room, not just for malice, but also for clumsiness, because sometimes people don't understand and they cross your boundaries. And if you set your boundary right next to your limit, and they cross one and they cross both because they're clumsy or they didn't understand you or they misheard a word you said, then like you're in a crisis. So anyway, building trust, set inconsequential boundaries, let people respect them, and then see where it gets to, see where you guys get together.
I love what you've shared about the boundary and the limit being in different places. This played out with, and yes, Marcia is brilliant. That's part of why I brought her to share with all of you all. But I was working with a colleague a few years ago, and I have some of the tightest boundaries with my students. Like I never date my students, mostly to keep the students safe, right? If there's the power dynamic just of teaching, and then I do sexual healing with people. And anyway, this colleague actually, he did break the agreements that we had in terms of our participants. But the thing you reflected back to me at the time, Marcia, which was so helpful, was the boundary actually worked because no student was harmed in the process, even though the agreement was broken. Now I stopped working with this person because I was like, well, they're no longer trustworthy. I can't have them around my students. So I changed that. But it was so helpful just to hear that, because the whole point of the boundary and the agreement was that students didn't get hurt and nobody did.
Right.
So that in the end, you helped me see that was actually a win.
And when you don't have your boundary right next to your limit, it's more likely that people screw up, or they are malicious, or they're thoughtless. Now you have information about how they operate in the world, and you haven't gotten totally clobbered in the process. Or in this case, your students didn't get clobbered in the process.
Right. Absolutely. So I feel like the questions are wrapping up. I'm so glad people enjoyed hearing more about Cuddle Party and what it's actually about. The stealth mission versus the overt mission.
Yeah.
But if people wanted to just share with Marcia, if each person wanted to just share a gem, which could be a highlight from this evening, or perhaps something that you're taking away that you learned from what she shared. And I'm just so excited. I told you already, I want to read this book for myself and then practice it out with my kid, even though I teach consent.
Yeah.
There's always more for us to learn. So yeah, I'm gonna lovingly turn off the recording so people don't get so shy.